some villains are not born from darkness. They are born from silence, from the moment they realize no one is coming back for them. And Erik Killmonger is what happens when that silence is never broken. As a child, abandonment does not feel like a single event. It feels like a permanent condition, like standing in a room where the door was left open but no one ever walks through it. And over time, that absence begins to speak louder than any words ever could, telling you that you are not worth staying for, not worth choosing, not worth loving. For Killmonger, that wound did not fade with time. It settled deep into his identity, shaping the way he saw the world and, more importantly, the way he saw himself. Because when a child grows up without belonging, they don't just lose people, they lose the blueprint for trust, for connection, for safety. So the pain does not disappear. It transforms, slowly, quietly, into something sharper, something more controlled, because anger is easier to carry than grief, and certainty is safer than vulnerability. He learned to reinterpret his abandonment, not as loss, but as injustice, not as something that happened to him, but as something the world owed him for. And in doing so, he built a version of himself that could survive that truth, a version that no longer waits, no longer asks, no longer hopes. But beneath that armor, the original wound remains untouched, because no amount of strength can erase the memory of being left behind. And this is where the conflict begins, not between right and wrong, but between who he had to become and who he was before the world decided he did not belong. There is always a moment, quiet and invisible, where pain stops asking to be healed and starts demanding to be justified. And for Killmonger, that moment becomes the foundation of everything that follows, because if the world refused to give him a place, then he would redefine the world itself until it made sense of his suffering. This is not just anger. It is meaning constructed from absence, a way to turn a childhood wound into a lifelong mission, because believing the world is broken is easier than believing you were simply forgotten. And maybe that is the most unsettling truth hidden beneath his story, that revenge is not always about destruction. Sometimes it is about being seen, about forcing a world that once ignored you to finally acknowledge that you were there all along, waiting, hurting, becoming something no one ever intended you to be. There is a subtle transformation that happens when a person realizes that pain alone is not enough to survive, that vulnerability without control becomes a liability. And for someone like Erik, the mind begins to adapt in ways that are both brilliant and deeply tragic, because instead of seeking comfort, he begins to study power, not as a desire, but as a necessity. Power, to him, is not about dominance. It is about insulation, about never having to feel that original helplessness again. And this is where his psychology shifts from wounded child to calculated strategist, because when emotional needs are left unmet for too long, they do not disappear, they evolve into systems of belief, into philosophies that justify why connection is dangerous and self-reliance is the only truth worth trusting. He does not simply reject vulnerability. He reframes it as weakness, something that must be eliminated in order to survive in a world that already proved it would not protect him. This is a classic form of psychological defense, a kind of emotional restructuring where the mind takes what once hurt and turns it into a rule, a law that governs every future decision. And in his case, that law becomes clear: never depend on anyone, never wait, never be the one left behind again. But here lies the deeper conflict, because human beings are not designed to exist without connection. And so even as he builds this identity of control and strength, there remains an underlying tension, a quiet contradiction between the part of him that still longs for belonging and the part that has declared belonging a dangerous illusion. This internal fracture does not resolve itself. It intensifies over time, because every achievement, every step closer to power, does not heal the wound. It only distances him further from the version of himself that once needed something simple, to be seen, to be chosen, to be held in a moment that never came. And so he becomes increasingly aligned with a worldview that validates his isolation, a belief that the world is fundamentally broken, not just for him, but for everyone like him. Because if his pain is part of a larger system, then it is no longer personal, it is purposeful. This is how the mind protects itself from meaninglessness, by turning suffering into ideology, by transforming a private wound into a universal truth. And once that shift happens, there is no easy return, because to question that belief would mean confronting the original pain all over again. The same emptiness, the same unanswered silence. So instead, he moves forward with certainty, not because he is free of doubt, but because doubt would reopen a door he has spent his entire life trying to seal shut. And in that sense, his strength is not the absence of pain. It is the refusal to ever feel it the same way again. There is a quiet contradiction living inside him that never fully disappears, no matter how strong he becomes, because beneath the certainty he projects to the world, there is still a part of him that remembers what it felt like to need someone and not have them there. And that memory does not fade. It lingers like an echo that refuses to be silenced. On one side, he has built an identity rooted in control, in independence, in the belief that relying on others is the first step toward being heard again. But on the other side, there remains an unmet need that cannot be erased, the fundamental human desire to belong, to be recognized, to feel that his existence matters to someone beyond himself. This is the core of his inner conflict, not simply anger versus calm, but connection versus self-protection, and the more he leans into one, the more the other begins to ache beneath the surface. He convinces himself that he does not need acceptance, that validation is something he can create through his own actions. But the truth is more complicated, because the need for belonging does not disappear when it is denied. It only becomes harder to reach, buried under layers of justification and emotional distance. Every step he takes toward power is also a step away from vulnerability. And while that distance protects him from being hurt again, it also isolates him from the very thing he once longed for, creating a cycle where the solution to his pain slowly becomes another form of it. This is what makes his psychology so complex, because he is not unaware of what he has lost. He simply believes that reclaiming it is no longer possible, and so he replaces that need with something else, something that feels more attainable, more controllable, even if it comes at the cost of emotional connection. There is also a deeper layer to this conflict, one that ties directly into identity, because when a person grows up without a clear sense of where they belong, they often search for meaning in external structures, in systems, in causes that promise clarity, and for him, that search becomes a way to resolve the internal chaos, to give direction to feelings that otherwise feel overwhelming and undefined. But even then, the conflict remains unresolved, because no external purpose can fully satisfy an internal void that was created in the absence of care and recognition. This is the paradox he lives with, that the stronger he becomes, the less he allows himself to feel, and the less he feels, the further he moves from the possibility of healing. And somewhere beneath all of that, there is still a question he never quite answers, not out loud, not even to himself. A question that has been there since the beginning, quietly shaping every decision, every belief, every step forward. And that question is not about power or justice. It is something much simpler and much more human. Why was I not enough for someone to stay? There is always a moment when a belief stops being questioned and starts becoming absolute. And for him, that moment does not arrive with chaos or noise. It arrives with clarity, with a realization so sharp and irreversible that it reshapes everything that came before it. It is the point where information and emotion collide, where the story he has been telling himself about his past is no longer just a feeling, but a confirmed truth. And that truth does not comfort him. It does not heal him. It validates the wound in a way that makes it impossible to ignore. Up until that moment, there is still a part of him that exists in uncertainty, a part that wonders if things could have been different, if there was another version of his life where he was not left behind. But when the truth of his origin fully reveals itself, that uncertainty disappears, and in its place comes something far more dangerous, certainty without hope. Because now, the abandonment is no longer just personal, it becomes systemic, intentional, something that feels chosen rather than accidental, and that distinction changes everything. Because pain that feels random can still be processed, but pain that feels deliberate demands a response. This is the psychological trigger, not the event itself, but the meaning he assigns to it, the interpretation that transforms a childhood wound into a moral justification. Because if he was abandoned by design, then the world itself becomes complicit in his suffering. And if the world is complicit, then it is no longer something to belong to. It is something to confront. In that moment, the internal conflict that once held him back begins to collapse, because the part of him that longed for connection can no longer survive in a reality where connection was denied at the most fundamental level, and so it retreats. It goes quiet, allowing the part of him built on anger and control to take over completely. This is not an explosion. It is a shift, a quiet but permanent reorientation of his identity, where he no longer sees himself as someone who was hurt, but as someone who has been wronged. And that difference is crucial, because being hurt invites healing, but being wronged invites action. From that point forward, every decision he makes is filtered through this new lens, a lens that no longer asks what he needs, but what must be done to make the world acknowledge what happened to him. The past is no longer something he carries. It becomes something he enforces, a narrative that must be proven, not just remembered. And this is where the transformation becomes irreversible, because once pain is turned into purpose, letting go of it would mean losing the very thing that gives his life direction. So he holds on to it, not because it feels good, but because it feels necessary, because in a world where he was once invisible, this belief gives him a way to be seen, even if it means becoming something he never originally intended to be. The transformation does not happen all at once. It unfolds quietly, almost invisibly, like a slow erosion of something that once held meaning, because the most dangerous psychological shifts are not explosive. They are gradual, built from repeated moments where the mind chooses certainty over vulnerability, control over connection, until one day there is nothing left of the person who once questioned those choices. For him, this is the point where pain is no longer something he carries. It becomes something he embodies, something that defines not just how he feels, but who he is. And once that line is crossed, there is no clear way back, because to separate himself from that pain would mean confronting the emptiness that existed before it had meaning. What makes this transformation so profound is that it feels logical to him. It feels earned, because every experience, every memory, every unanswered need seems to support the identity he has constructed, reinforcing the belief that the world is divided between those who take and those who are left behind. And so he aligns himself with that belief completely, allowing it to guide his perception, his decisions, his sense of purpose, until it becomes indistinguishable from reality itself. At this stage, the internal conflict that once created hesitation begins to dissolve, not because it has been resolved, but because one side has been silenced. The part of him that once sought connection is no longer given space to exist, replaced entirely by a version of himself that sees emotional distance as strength and empathy as a risk he can no longer afford. This is the psychological breakdown, not in the sense of losing control, but in the sense of losing balance, where one aspect of the self overtakes all others, creating a rigid identity that cannot adapt, cannot soften, cannot reconsider. There is also a subtle shift in how he interprets the world around him, because once pain becomes identity, every interaction, every observation is filtered through that lens, confirming what he already believes rather than challenging it. And this creates a closed system of thought, a loop where the past continuously validates the present, and the present justifies the future. In this state, even moments that could offer understanding or reconciliation are reinterpreted as threats or deceptions, because accepting them would require him to question the foundation he has built his entire life upon. And so, the transformation completes itself, not with a single decision, but with the absence of doubt, with a mind that no longer entertains alternative possibilities, because doing so would mean reopening a wound he has worked so hard to contain. What remains is not just a person shaped by pain, but a person who has fully synchronized with it, where the original desire to be seen, to belong, to be valued has been replaced by something colder, something more stable, a purpose that no longer depends on others, but at the same time, no longer allows him to be truly connected to anyone at all. What remains after the transformation is not relief, not resolution, but a quiet and persistent emptiness that no amount of control can fully eliminate, because when a person builds their identity around pain, they also inherit its limitations, its rigidity, its inability to adapt to anything that does not align with that original wound. For him, The long-term consequence is not just isolation from others. It is isolation within himself, a disconnection from the parts of his identity that once sought something softer, something human, something that did not require constant vigilance or emotional distance. Over time, this creates a psychological environment where trust becomes nearly impossible, not because others are inherently untrustworthy, but because his internal framework no longer allows for it. Every interaction is filtered through a lens of skepticism. Every gesture is measured against the expectation of eventual disappointment. This does not make him feel powerful. It makes him feel controlled, trapped within a system of beliefs that once protected him, but now limit his ability to experience anything outside of that structure. There is also a deeper consequence that often goes unnoticed, the loss of emotional range. Because when a person suppresses vulnerability for long enough, they do not just eliminate pain. They also lose access to the full spectrum of connection. Joy becomes muted, empathy becomes conditional, and relationships become transactional rather than meaningful. This is the cost of survival when it is built on avoidance rather than healing, a life that functions but does not fully feel. And yet, from his perspective, this cost seems justified, because the alternative, returning to a state of openness, would mean risking the same abandonment that shaped him in the first place, and that risk feels far more dangerous than the emptiness he now carries. There is also a cyclical nature to this outcome, because the more he distances himself emotionally, the more he reinforces the belief that connection is unreliable, and the more that belief is reinforced, the less likely he is to ever challenge it, creating a loop that sustains itself without the need for external validation. In this way, his past continues to dictate his present, not as a memory, but as an active force shaping every decision, every perception, every moment of interaction. And perhaps the most profound consequence is that even if the world were to offer him the belonging he once needed, he might not recognize it. Or worse, he might reject it, because accepting it would require him to question the identity he has spent his entire life constructing. So he remains where he is, not because there is no other path, but because the path he has chosen feels safer, more certain, even if it leads him further away from the very thing he has been searching for all along. A place where he does not have to prove his worth, a place where he is simply allowed to exist and be seen. There is a reason his story feels uncomfortable to watch, and it is not because of what he does. It is because of what he represents, a version of pain that feels uncomfortably familiar, a version that does not belong only to him, but echoes quietly in the lives of people who have ever felt overlooked, dismissed, or left behind without explanation. Because abandonment does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it is subtle. It is the unanswered message, the absence of support when it was needed most, the moment you realize that the people you expected to stay have already moved on. And in that silence, something inside you begins to shift. You start to question your own worth, not out loud, but in small, persistent ways, wondering what was missing, what you could have done differently, why you were not enough for someone to remain. And just like him, many people learn to cope not by healing that question, but by burying it, by replacing it with something more manageable, like independence, like emotional distance, like telling yourself that you do not need anyone at all. But that belief comes with a cost, because the more you convince yourself that you do not need connection, the more disconnected you actually become, and over time, that distance can start to feel like your natural state, even though it was never what you truly wanted. There is also the feeling of being misunderstood, of carrying an internal experience that no one else seems to fully see, where your reactions, your guardedness, your intensity are judged without anyone understanding where they come from. And that can deepen the isolation even further, because it reinforces the idea that opening up will not lead to understanding, it will only lead to more distance. In that sense, his story is not just about one person. It becomes a mirror, reflecting the quiet struggles that many people carry without ever naming them, the loneliness that exists even in crowded rooms, the effort it takes to appear strong when there is still something fragile underneath. And perhaps the most difficult part is recognizing that the same patterns he follows are not entirely foreign, that the instinct to protect yourself, to close off, to turn pain into something more controlled, is something many people have experienced in smaller, less visible ways. It raises a question that lingers long after the story ends, not about him, but about us, about how we respond to our own wounds, whether we allow them to be felt or whether we reshape them into something that distances us from others. And in doing so, we begin to understand that his path, while extreme, is not completely separate from our own. It is simply a version of what happens when pain is left alone for too long without anyone there to soften its edges. There comes a point where even the anger begins to fade, not because it has been resolved, but because it has exhausted itself, leaving behind something quieter, something heavier, a kind of emptiness that is harder to define because it no longer has a clear direction, no clear target, just a lingering absence that sits beneath everything he does. This is the stage where the external purpose remains intact, where the identity he built continues to function, but internally, there is a growing distance between what he shows and what he actually feels, because when a person has spent so long transforming pain into action, they often lose access to the original emotion itself, and what remains is not relief, but a hollow version of it. For him, this emptiness is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It exists in the quiet moments, in the spaces where there is no task to complete, no mission to justify his existence. And in those moments, the question he has avoided for so long begins to surface again, not as anger, but as silence, a silence that asks what is left when the purpose is gone, when there is nothing left to prove. And that is where the loneliness becomes most visible, not in the absence of people, but in the absence of connection, because even when surrounded by others, there is a barrier that cannot be crossed, a distance that is maintained not by circumstance, but by design, by the very identity he has created to protect himself. This kind of loneliness is different. It is not about being alone. It is about being unreachable, about existing in a space where no one else can fully enter, and over time, that space begins to feel permanent, like a room without doors, where the only voice you hear is your own, repeating the same beliefs that once gave you strength but now offer no comfort. There is also a subtle realization that begins to emerge, one that is difficult to confront, that despite everything he has become, despite all the control, all the certainty, the original need has not disappeared. It has simply been buried, and in rare moments, it surfaces as a quiet longing, not for power, not for validation, but for something much simpler, to be understood without having to justify himself, to exist without having to defend his place in the world. But that longing is quickly suppressed, because acknowledging it would mean admitting that the armor he built is not complete, that there is still a part of him that remains unprotected, and that vulnerability is something he has trained himself to avoid at all costs. So the emptiness remains, not as a flaw, but as a consequence, a byproduct of a life shaped by survival rather than connection. And in that emptiness, there is a kind of stillness that feels almost peaceful on the surface, but underneath, it carries the weight of everything that was never said, never felt, never healed. In the end, what makes his story linger is not the path he chose, but the question it leaves behind, a quiet, uncomfortable reflection on what happens when a person is never given the chance to feel that they belong anywhere at all, because beneath everything he became, there was always a simpler need that was never met, a need that did not require power or recognition or control, but something far more fragile, to be seen without having to prove his worth, to be accepted without having to fight for it. And when that need goes unanswered for too long, it does not disappear, it transforms, it adapts, it finds other ways to exist, sometimes in ambition, sometimes in anger, sometimes in a relentless pursuit of meaning that feels strong on the surface, but is rooted in something much softer underneath. His journey forces us to confront a difficult truth about human nature, that people do not just act based on who they are, but based on what they have been denied. And when that denial touches something as fundamental as belonging, it reshapes not only how they see the world, but how they see themselves within it. It is easy to look at someone like him and focus on the outcome, to label, to judge, to create distance between his choices and our own lives. But that distance becomes harder to maintain when we recognize the emotional origins of those choices, when we see that the need to be understood, to be valued, to not feel invisible is something that exists in all of us, just expressed in different ways, at different intensities. And maybe that is where the real weight of his story lies, not in what he did, but in what he reveals about the human condition, that there is a fragile line between resilience and detachment, between strength and isolation, and that line is often shaped by whether or not someone was there when we needed them most. Because if pain can be transformed into purpose, then it can also be transformed into distance, into a life that looks complete from the outside but feels unresolved on the inside. And that raises a question that does not belong only to him, but to anyone who has ever felt unseen, unheard, or left behind, a question that does not demand an immediate answer, but lingers in the quiet spaces we try to avoid, asking us to reflect not on who he became, but on what we might become if our own wounds were left unattended for too long, and whether we would choose to face them or reshape them into something that slowly pulls us further away from the connection we have been searching for all along.